So let's take a look at some of the months before, okay, to see if Mr. Alexander's behavior in any way supports the verbiage, okay?
All right.
So we talked about, I think you mentioned on January 1st of 2008. Does Mr. Alexander send Miss Arias a text message?
Yes.
And does he tell her that he loves her?
Yes.
And then when he tells her that he loves her, does he, Mr. Alexander is making the initial contact, isn't that right?
Correct.
And then Miss Arias responds to him?
Yes.
In a nice manner, doesn't she?
She loves him too.
Is that in any way behavior that supports being afraid of her?
Not that I can figure out.
Are you also aware of the fact that he took her to have a soup pie on a trip with him in September of 2007? Do you remember that?
Yes.
And did they take another trip together in November of 2007 to New Mexico?
Yes, they did.
Is that behavior suggestive that Mr. Alexander is somehow afraid of her?
No, that does not suggest he was
Throughout
afraid of her.
the written items that you have with regard to text messages and instant messages, and let's for a second, we'll just forget about the journals that you have from Miss Arias, okay?
All right.
Just these conversations that you have between Mr. Alexander and Miss Arias. Is there a constant line of communication between them that you know of from the time the text messages start, from the time that you have evidence of the text messages, from December of 2007 up till June 2008? Is there a constant line of communication between the two?
Yes, there is.
And is that consistent with what Miss Arias told you?
It's consistent with what she told me.
The fact that we know that just 9 days prior to May 19th, so on May 10th, 2008, did you listen to a sex tape or phone sex tape that was recorded on May 10th of 2008?
Yes, I did.
And that tape is between Mr. Alexander and Miss Arias, right?
Correct.
In fact, you were asked questions about how sometimes the spoken word can sometimes be better than just a written word, right?
Yes.
Do you remember that line of questioning?
Yes.
Well, in this sense, the spoken word, even though it's only one item of spoken words, you can listen to Mr. Alexander's voice, right?
Yes, I can.
And during this sex tape that he makes with her 9 days prior to claiming he's afraid of her, does he sound afraid at all?
Objection. Characterization. This sex tape he makes with her.
Approach.
Did you listen to a conversation that occurred on May 10th, 2008 between Mr. Alexander and Miss LaViolette? The conversation having to do with sex?
Yes.
Okay. And when you listened to that conversation, were you able to hear Mr. Alexander's words and the things that he said?
Yes, I was.
Were you able to hear his tone of voice?
Yes.
And were you certainly able to hear the content of what he was talking about?
Yes.
And in any of this tape that you listened to, does he ever sound like he's afraid?
No.
Does he ever say anything to Jodi on the tape like, I don't want you to be near me?
No.
Does he ever say anything to her about stay away from me?
No.
Does he ever say to her, you're stalking me, get out of my life?
No.
In fact, do they have a conversation about the fact that she's going to Utah?
Yes.
And do you remember that during the time that that they're talking about her going to Utah, that Mr. Alexander immediately said, well, what are you going to go up there for?
Yes, he did.
And specifically, Miss Arias, did she ever tell him about Ryan Burns on this particular tape?
No.
Did she talk about just going to see friends?
Yes.
Because that's not taunting him, right? She's not telling him anything about potential other men in her life, right?
Not in this tape.
Do you remember
No.
reviewing text messages between Miss Arias and Mr. Alexander, that at one point during these text messages, Mr. Alexander is telling her, come on in, let yourself in.
Yes.
And that it's obvious from those messages that he's inviting her to just come in to his house?
Yes, and have some guac.
Guacamole?
Uh-huh.
Is that a yes?
Yes.
Is that behavior typical of somebody who is afraid of being stalked by that person?
No.
Do you remember reviewing text messages prior to May 19th that Mr. Alexander sent specifically to Miss Arias that she was the prettiest girl he knew?
Yes.
And that he talked about how much he thought of her, not just her looks on the outside, but her looks on the inside, or what she was like on the inside as well.
Yes, he was comparing her to other women in the club that he was at.
And was it a very flattering email?
Yes, it was.
And it wasn't, was it sexual at all?
No, it wasn't.
So was it just a flattering email just on her personality itself?
Yes.
Is that something typical that someone who's afraid of her would have done?
No.
When Miss Arias comes to his house at his beckoning on June 4th,
Yes.
and they fall asleep together, do you remember that?
Yes.
That information? They fall asleep together and then wake up and he takes pictures of her, right?
Correct.
The fact that he would fall asleep and allow someone who he's supposedly afraid of sleep next to him, is that typical behavior of somebody who's afraid of that person sleeping next to them?
No. Well,
yes?
if you're talking specifically about Mr. Alexander's fear, because when you're talking about Miss Arias, she's also sleeping next to him. And what I would say about that is that, for the most part, people who are abused aren't afraid all the time. They tend to get scared when they see an indication that the other person is getting upset, either by tone of voice, by how they look, by their behavior, but they're not always afraid. So I wanted to clarify that.
Sure. And does this go to some of what you were asked on cross about the difference between stalking behavior versus somebody who's in a domestic violence relationship?
Yes.
The difference between judging the two of those?
Yes.
Okay.
And if they're stalking in a domestic violence relationship, there's a lot of fear in that situation too. And oftentimes the stalking in a domestic violence relationship happens after the relationship ends and the person is more frightened and will go after the person.
Okay. You were asked questions about their relationship, Mr. Alexander and Miss Arias, their relationship ending in June of 2007. Do you remember that?
Yes.
And the characterization that their relationship was over as of June 2007. Do you remember that?
Yes.
This characterizes her answer as June or July of 2007.
Sustained.
Did they break up June 29th of 2007?
Objection leading.
Yes.
Okay. So the end of their relationship being June of 2007, right?
Correct.
After they broke up, the next day, was there contact between the two?
I do not recall.
Okay. Within a week of that time, do you know if there was contact?
Yes, there was.
Okay. And was there continuing contact after that?
Yes, there was.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to take a 10-minute recess at this time. Please be back in the designated area at 2:45. We will start promptly at that time, 2:45.